Today's guest is Brian Aoaeh, co-founder of REFASHIONed Ventures. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And let's start with what does your company do?
So REFASHIONed Ventures is a venture fund, an early stage venture fund. And we're building it because we believe that if you stand in 2020 and look out towards the future, we think that the biggest and most attractive investment opportunity of our lifetimes is the transformation or refashioning of supply chains around the world, so to speak. So we're raising a venture fund to invest in the startup founders who want to be the catalysts in that transformation.
Yeah. Okay. So your name is actually a play on fashion as well as the verb refashioning.
It's actually more a play on refashioning and transforming than anything else. In fairness to my partner and co-founder Lisa, the three partners and co-founders who are building the fund. But in fairness to Lisa, when she first had the idea, it was in the context of the opportunities in the fashion and apparel supply chain. And so the phrase in her head was, the fashion supply chain is broken and it needs to be refashioned. But then when we came together, we decided that the opportunity in supply chain more broadly, since supply chain is a horizontal across all industries in the world, is the one that we should be pursuing. So
yeah.
But you're absolutely right. When most people see our name, the first thing they think of, oh, you're a fashion fund. Well, we do fashion and we do a lot of other things.
Sure.
A lot of other things too.
Yes, no, I have the advantage of knowing you long enough to understand that. But
yeah.
But, okay, so let's actually go back in time and talk about your family life, what your parents did, what your siblings, if you have any, do, and how they influenced you.
My parents are teachers. Both my parents are teachers. Growing up, my mom taught in an elementary school, and my dad taught English at a university in northern Nigeria. My younger sister is in the civil service in Ghana. She works in the Accountant General's department, and now she's in the Ministry of Fisheries. And my younger brother lives with my parents, does various entrepreneurial things in northern Nigeria and Kano. I'd say the impact on my personality. So my parents are really good teachers. Sometimes I wish I had them as teachers instead of as parents. But they have a gift. They have a real gift for imparting a very deep love of learning in the pupils that go through their tutelage, and so I think I took some of that with me. And then I spent my teenage years living with my grandfather. When I wasn't in school, I lived with him in the village. And my grandfather was a peasant farmer in the village I come from in northern Ghana. And so at least with him, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but as a young man, he suffered a debilitating illness, which left him, one, with a hunched back, and two, with chronic rheumatoid arthritis. And yet I never saw him complain once about anything. I mean, he would be in pain and I'd have to, but he never complained about it. In fact, remarkably, every year he would have the biggest harvest in the village. And his more able-bodied compatriots would often come to him because, the rains would be bad, their harvest would be poor, they were running out of food, they needed some help. And that taught me a lot about, remaining positive in the face of difficulty, not making excuses, working hard.
That's a great role model. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool. So, I mean, being a farmer, that is entrepreneurial. You're
It,
you're you're running your own business. It's you.
it's exactly, it's very, very entrepreneurial. In fact, I've often thought that a great blog post would be the lessons you can learn from farming that, you know, translate to either being a venture capitalist or being a startup founder. Because you're absolutely right, it is entirely you. And much like with entrepreneurship, there are so many things you can't control, right? You can't control if pests come and wipe out your harvest. You can't control if the rains are on time. You can't control if some sort of disease crops up and destroys, and so you really have to focus on what you have control over and do those extremely well, so that no matter what the circumstances are, you come out better than you would have if you did not work as hard as you needed to. So.
Sure, sure. It's also about working smart. You can work very, very hard and still fail.
It's also about working smart. So one of the things I learned being at his side as a teenager is the importance of rest. Right, he worked extremely hard, but when he rested, he took his rest. He took his
Uh-huh.
almost as seriously as he took working hard. So
Yeah, yeah, that is a good lesson.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people don't remember to revitalize.
Yeah, yeah. I just last night or early this morning, I was reading a blog post by Ryan about some of the difficulties that he just stepped down as I don't know him, but he just stepped down as the CEO of Circle Up.
This is Ryan.
Kalbeck.
Uh-huh.
Is his last name. He wrote a great post about stepping down as the CEO of Circle Up, and many of the things he talked about were things that I could say, you know, you could draw parallels between being a farmer and some of the experiences.
Uh-huh.
Some of the experiences that he had. One thing that I've actually never talked about, but this might be a good time to talk about it, is during that time, one of the things I did, because obviously during the farming season, there are times when you're actually farming, and then there's a dry season when you're not really farming. It's after the harvest, there's no rain, and so you're not really farming. And so during that time, I would help my cousins and uncles who took care of our herd of cattle, and so I learned to be a cattle head. And so imagine herding a herd of 20 or 30 cattle, and you wake up, you take them out, they roam around, they graze, and then you have to bring them home in the evening. There's a lot that you learn about dealing with stubborn people. There's a lot that you learn about dealing with stubborn hearted,
Getting behind and shoving them.
who have a mind of their own and don't really care for whatever it is you think they should be.
Yeah, this puts to shame the idea of herding cats. I like it. That's excellent. Okay, so how did Refashion get started? Obviously, I met you when you were still working for another investment fund, and you left to strike out on your own.
Yeah.
What precipitated that?
So basically, we got to a point where it didn't look like we would be able to continue with KC Ventures in the form at which it existed. And so, different people on the team went off to do different things. I think the fund has now been absorbed back into the family office, because that's where we had our genesis. And I met Lisa in June of 2016. And before we teamed up to form Refashioned in 2018, we came together to build the New York supply chain meetup in 2017. And the idea for the meetup arose because I got to a point in developing a thesis around investing in supply chain and innovation and technology, where I said I really need to be hanging out with supply chain people. And I thought someone in New York had created a meetup where supply chain folks could meet. And when I say that, people, the audience might, people in the audience might think, well, aren't there already trade associations? We're not a trade association, in the sense that we aren't designing a community for supply chain people to meet with other supply chain people and talk about how mutually wonderful they all are.
As fun as that might be.
That's not what we're building. What we want to do is, to bring together the startup founders who usually understand the technology but don't have a deep background in the industry. And we talk of them as the builders of early stage supply chain innovation, with the industry executives who usually have a deep understanding of the industry and the problems in the industry, but not necessarily how far along the technology has come. The issue is that if there isn't a place for these two groups of people to have a low risk, low stakes conversation, it becomes much more difficult to have those initial high risk, high stakes conversations, because you haven't had a time to learn enough.
Right.
Rather. And so
that's essential. That's essential for the growth of any skill set.
Right.
I can relate it to the performing world, in which you saw these amazing performers come out of the vaudeville era. I don't know how familiar you are with that. Well, it was a period of time in American history in which there were circuits of performance venues that were broadly called vaudeville, and people would, it was the only form of mass entertainment, and people would, performers would be on this circuit and perform many times a day.
Yeah.
And the old comedians, Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers and all of these, who went on to movie stardom, they perfected their craft by doing it many times a day. It again relates to that 10,000 hours to develop a skill. They just weren't talented. They had that talent and honed it and refined their craft over many times. And by creating this community, you're right. You're creating a platform in which people can practice their craft and learn.
That's precisely the idea. And in fact, when we're having an event and startup founders are nervous about, I've never spoken, I said, this is my first time. I tell them, take a deep breath, relax. Everybody in the audience is going to be there because they specifically want to hear about what you're doing. So the idea is, you tell us what you're doing, do it as well as you can. It's probably going to be great because you wouldn't be building what you're building if you weren't great at something. So it's probably going to be great. And then our job as the audience is to say, this seems right, but this one thing, the way you described it doesn't seem quite right. If you shifted the way you described it a little bit, it would land much better. And then obviously, if there's someone in the audience that would be an immediate customer and they felt the urge to come and talk to you right after the presentation, then that's,
sure.
That's even amazing. We've had events where speakers said, even before the event started, they were exchanging business cards with potential customers or potential investors and whatnot. And that's precisely why we're building the
Yeah, now, and I've been following you since you first started this, and I mean, it's like the growth of the New York community and more impressively, national and international community has been just like wildfire. So talk a little about that. I mean, how'd you pull that one off?
So if I told you it was our genius that led us to where we are, I would be lying. The initial idea was a really simple one. You know, we just wanted to hang out with our people, with people who obsess about supply chain and innovation and technology.
And
And
you
so
found a ready audience to a ready community to be brought together.
yes, and so the idea was we'll do this in New York. But I'm a very big, Lisa and I are both big believers in one, you know, talking to other people about what we're trying to do. And so we talked about this on social media. And very quickly, even before we had our first event in New York, people in other parts of the world reached out to us, and other parts of the US reached out to us and said, hey, we've heard about what you're trying to do in New York. It turns out that we would benefit from having a community like that. We would benefit from having a community
Yeah,
like that
yeah.
too. Would you help us try to establish a community like that where, you know, in the cities where, so, you know, Los Angeles, Atlanta, some people in Europe, various cities in Europe, some places in Asia, even someone in Australia was talking about this. But then for the people abroad, they also said, oh, and by the way, we would like if any communities that we develop would be connected to your community in New York. And I thought to
That's
myself,
a big thing. That's cool.
and I thought to myself, whoa, I'm not really signing up for a whole lot of work. I just want to hang out. I just want to hang out with some smart people. And so I asked them,
Oops.
and so I asked them, why do you want to be connected to our community in New York? And they said something that should have been obvious to me, but that I hadn't thought about, right? They said, well, as startup founders, if we're successful, we invariably are going to need to pursue customers in the United States or to raise capital from investors in the United States. And if there is a community of people like the one that you're developing that we can immediately tap into, even before we're in the United States, that would be amazing. And so then the idea occurred to us that maybe what we should develop is a network of meetup communities. So each one will be started and run by someone local to that community who understands what the community needs. But we'll ensure that everyone is connected and that we can help as startups when they need.
Yeah, so let me jump in just a moment to bring our audience up to speed, since you and I both are too familiar. Your co-founders are Lisa Morales Helebo. Is that the correct way to pronounce her name?
Yes, I believe that's the correct way to pronounce it.
And Simon
Campbell.
Okay, I just wanted to get that out for our audience, that when you refer to them, that's who we're talking about.
Yes, that's what we're talking about. Yeah, so then it became this idea of developing a network of communities. Now, it turns out that building a community is a lot of work. I think you might know that. And so the earliest people who said to us, "Hey, this sounds like a great idea," have turned out not to be the ones who have gotten the communities going, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be that in any social group. You have somebody who goes, "Hey, you know, somebody ought to do that," and it's rarely them who want to be that somebody. Meaning, why don't you do this for me?
And we also I think when you're building a community, we've seen it with ourselves that if the community starts from a place of enthusiasm and passion, rather than someone else mandating that it be done, it's more likely to survive. So, for example, I think Startup Grind grew very slowly until they were maybe 5 years old, and then their growth really took off. Creative Mornings, I think, also had the same experience. For the first 4 or 5 years, it was a real grind, and now they're in over 150 countries, I think. Even TED, the world famous TED organization,
yeah
some real stumbles in its early life before it really became what it is now. And so I think we're doing fine.
Yeah. So let me then kind of shift the focus to, you've been very successful at creating this culture. How is that reflected in Refashioned Ventures itself? Are there more than three of you? How large is the company, and how do you create this culture?
So Refashion Ventures is still in the early stages. I don't know if you know much about raising a venture fund. It's incredibly difficult. In fact,
Yes.
so some people will say it's a little more difficult than raising capital for a company, because at least with a company there's a definitive thing that
Right.
people
Right.
invest in. So we're still trying to raise the fund, and so we're talking to LPs. Right now, it's really the three of us
Uh-huh.
are doing all the work. I'm very tentative about bringing other people on this early, because
Sure. Sure. You have to be very careful about your burn rate.
yeah,
Just staying viable.
yeah. So it's the three of us. We're hoping that we can do a first close sometime this year, and then that of course will speed things up.
Mhm.
Understand?
Okay, well, let's jump to your expertise, which is the industry broadly. Where do you see the supply chain industry going? Obviously, we've got this huge shift. The As I've mentioned in other things, there's a concept in biology that was promoted by biologist Stephen Jay Gould, called punctuated equilibrium, in which he talks about evolution not being a straight path, but you have levels of stasis where things are at an equilibrium, and then some event
Yeah,
comes to punctuate that and cause a change that precipitates
yeah.
evolution. I think we're in one of them now, and I'm not out on a limb here. With this pandemic
No,
is huge, and what's it going to do for supply chain?
I think you're absolutely right, and I'll describe a conversation I've had with a few people, and I'm sure that others who haven't made these comments more explicitly are thinking it in their minds. But sometimes when I say to people that supply chain is the biggest investment opportunity that we're going to see in our lifetime, some people will respond and say, no, it's obviously climate change. Climate change is the biggest issue that mankind has to deal with, and so it's the biggest opportunity. And I agree with them. I agree with them 100% that climate change is is what they describe. The connection they fail to make between climate change and supply chains is that generally scientists agree that human activity is either causing climate change or at a minimum is making it worse than it otherwise would be. Now, the thing about human activity is that all human activity is driven by supply chains. And so invariably, if you're going to solve the climate change problem, you have to take a look at supply chains and figure out, as we like to say, figure out how you're going to refashion them
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that climate change is slowed to an acceptable pace. And I think you are absolutely right that if this was a difficult connection for people to make, the pandemic has made it much more obvious. One, individual consumers are much more aware of how what they do, what they buy, what they consume impacts the supply chain. Executives in companies now understand just how fragile their supply chains are, and
Yeah.
so not only do they have to do something about their operations and supply chain, but then individual consumers, because of this awareness, are putting pressure on companies to do better. And then governments are finally getting in on the action as well. So in Europe especially, there are a lot of laws. I think many have started with looking at the fashion industry specifically, but then as they work on fashion, they start to look at other. The interesting thing about fashion is that it's one of these industries that relies on every other industry, right? So there's culture, there's energy consumption, there's materials, there's manufacturing, there's data, there's logistics, there's transportation. Right, there's the healthcare of the workers in the fashion industry. And so it's one of these industries that once governments start to tackle it and say, hey, you have to do better, it's very easy for them to then go from, okay, let's focus, well, there's manufacturing, let's talk about manufacturing, there's, so yeah.
So do you want to hazard a guess as to where we're going to, where we're going to end up in the next 5-10 years?
I'm an optimist, and so I think, I really think we don't have a choice but to be optimistic about the future. So I think as difficult as the problems we face, I think human beings will figure out a way to solve them. And if I'm wrong, then we'll all be dead anyway, and it won't matter.
There we go.
Matter that I'm wrong.
Okay, stock up on beer and wine. Terrific. It looks like we're near our time for stopping. Is that I guess that's true, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell our audience how they can reach you, how they can be part of your community, how they can, as the LPs, can contact you so that they can support what you're doing and benefit from your wisdom.
Yeah, so we're very easy to find online. If they type in, if the audience types in supply chain and meetup or supply chain and VC, we're likely to be on the first page. And my name is easy enough to remember. Well, it's not easy to remember, but it's unique to find online. It's Aoaeh. And so if you type that into Google, page 1 should be filled with
there you go,
and information. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. My guest today has been Brian Aoaeh, co-founder of REFASHIONed Ventures.
Thank you, Marcus. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.